Welcome back to Alien Love Stories. And today I beg you, never blow out birthday candles without checking the cake for planetary class anomalies. Because when your grandma eats half of a weaponized dessert and says it tastes like destiny, well, you're going to need a bigger fork. I didn't know. Let me say that again, slowly, for the intergalactic tribunal that may or may not already be tracking this frequency. I didn't. No. It was my 29th birthday, a year I had carefully planned to celebrate with precisely zero drama. No surprises, no cosmic interference, just close friends, lukewarm jokes, and enough wine to forget that I still hadn't paid off my hover bike from 3 years ago. I was going to order a simple cake, vanilla, maybe caramel swirl if I was feeling wild, but I never placed the order. I swear I didn't. Yet at 3:17 a.m. on the day of my party, my doorbell rang like it had just finished a seance. I opened the door still half asleep and wearing pajama pants with cartoon planets on them, ironic in retrospect. And there it was, a silver box on my doorstep. No delivery person, no receipt, just the box, glowing faintly, humming like it was clearing its throat. A single sticker rested on the top. To Jason, from someone who remembers. And because I'm a trusting idiot with the curiosity of a caffeinated raccoon, I brought it inside. I opened it. It was beautiful. The cake inside shimmered, literally. The surface of the frosting looked like a nebula trapped in sugar, swirling with iridescent light that shifted depending on how you tilted your head. There were flakes floating above it. Not on it, above it, hovering in a slow, perfect orbit. I should have been suspicious, alarmed. I should have called NASA, or at least Mom. Instead, I took a photo and posted it with the caption, "Birthday level, extraterrestrial pastry chef." My friend Luca replied with 17 alien emojis and one, "You gonna eat that or use it to summon God?" I didn't eat it right away. I just placed it carefully on the kitchen counter and stared at it like it was going to grow legs and recite Shakespeare. Eventually, I got sleepy and went to bed, blissfully unaware that I had just invited something into my home that could destabilize a small solar system. Grandma Sheila arrived first because, of course she did. She's always early, always carrying food, always ready to insult your life choices under the guise of love. That day, she came in holding her usual 3 Tupperware containers, wearing a t-shirt that said, "My blood type is iced coffee," and announcing, "If you're not married by 30, you marry yourself. That way you never cheat and you always know where the remote is." I love that woman. Even when she weaponizes casseroles, she immediately zeroed in on the cake like a heat-seeking missile. "What's this?" "My birthday cake," I said casually, trying to sound like this was totally normal. She leaned in and sniffed. "Smells intense." "Yeah," I said. "Kind of dark chocolate with, I don't know, maybe a hint of starfruit?" Good density," she muttered. And before I could say another word, she pulled out a knife from her purse. Yes, she carries her own cake knife, don't ask. And sliced a generous quarter. No candle, no ceremony, just raw grandma instinct. She took a bite, chewed, and said with a twinkle in her eye, "Moist." That was the last normal thing that happened all day, because 32 seconds later, the cake lit up. Not metaphorically. I mean, it literally began to glow from the inside, pulses of soft golden light radiating outward in concentric rings. The hovering flakes began spinning faster. The air felt charged, like standing too close to a lightning storm, while also being extremely aware of your own mortality. And Grandma? She burped once, then blinked slowly, then calmly floated 3 inches off the floor. Everyone else had just arrived at the party. They walked into the living room, saw Grandma hovering above the rug like a confused oracle, and paused mid-greeting. Aunt May dropped the tray of deviled eggs. Luca said, "Holy sh..." before I cut him off with a panicked whisper. "Language! Grandma's still conscious." Except she wasn't, or rather she was, but not as we knew her. Her eyes opened, and they were glowing. Not Hollywood CGI glow. I mean stars. Her irises swirled like galaxies caught in slow motion, and when she spoke, Her voice sounded like it had been harmonized across 11 dimensions and filtered through a music box made of moonlight. She said, "The weapon has chosen flesh," which, for the record, is not how most birthday parties begin. Uncle Ted fainted. Luca whispered, "I think your cake might be sentient?" "More like strategic," said a voice behind us. We turned to see a tall, silver-skinned woman standing in my hallway, like she'd been summoned by the smell of existential dread. Her eyes shimmered. Her hair flowed upward, like it didn't believe in gravity. She wore robes made of light and regret. She said, "I am Archivist 12 of the Galactic table. The Arma cake was never meant to activate on this planet." I blinked. "The what now?" She gestured to the cake. "The Arma cake, a confectionery containment protocol for the emotions of a long-dead star god. It was supposed to be frozen indefinitely. Insecure storage facilities. Yes, I see the flaw now." "You're telling me," I said slowly, "that this cake contains the feelings of an ancient, weaponized deity?" She nodded. "And my grandma just ate half of it?" "She has absorbed the heart layer. The core may still be intact." Then she looked at me, specifically at the half of the cake still sitting uncut on the table. "You have approximately 42 minutes before the internal emotional reactor destabilizes." "Before what?" "Before this building becomes a beacon to every weapon-seeking species in 1,000 parsecs." I turned back to Grandma. She was floating upside down now, humming and glowing brighter. "Happy birthday to me, South to recap." My grandma was levitating 3 inches above our coffee table. She had just consumed half of a birthday cake that turned out to be a containment system for the emotional remains of a forgotten star god. Her eyes now glowed with celestial memory. Her voice sounded like a choir inside a black hole, and she had begun humming the theme to Golden Girls in a minor key that made several plants in the room wilt. Archivist 12, the glowing alien woman who had suddenly appeared in my hallway, was now pointing a scanner the size of a toaster at Grandma's head, while muttering something about resonance thresholds and empathy shockwaves. "Okay," I said, trying to make sense of the situation. "What do we do?" Archivist 12 turned slowly, with the weariness of someone who had clearly dealt with pastry-based apocalypses before. "We must extract the remaining core before her mortal biology finishes metabolizing the heart layer. If not, she will imprint permanently, and the weapon will assume a human form." Wait, I said. "Are you telling me that if we don't act fast, my grandma will literally become the embodiment of a galactic weapon of mass emotional destruction?" "Yes. She's 79. Then she'll be the most emotionally volatile 79-year-old in this quadrant. I mean, she already kind of is." Archivist 12 turned back to Grandma and took a cautious step forward. "Subject appears stable, but emotionally fortified. The absorption rate is accelerating." My mom entered the room at that exact moment holding a tray of cinnamon rolls and said, "Oh, she always gets like this when she skips her blood pressure meds." Then she saw the floating, the glowing, the alien. She blinked. "Do we need decaf?" I gently removed the tray from her hands before she could throw it at the alien. "No sudden movements," I whispered. That's when Grandma finally spoke again. "Mortals," she said in a voice that echoed off the windows and possibly off the moon. "I require olives." We all paused. "Olives?" I repeated. "Green," she added. "The kind with the little red bits inside, and a throne." Archivist 12 turned to me. "It has begun." "Excuse me." "The emotional architecture is asserting preference. This is how weapon forms begin. Random abstract demands followed by declarations of sovereignty." Grandma floated another few inches higher. "I, Sheila of Earth, hereby claim the dining room as my galactic seat of influence. Bring me finger sandwiches and someone to explain the stock market." Uncle Ted, who had woken up after fainting earlier, raised his hand and said, "I don't understand any of this, but I second the motion." I pushed past the growing crowd of stunned family members and grabbed Archivist 12 by the shoulder. "You said we have a window? What do we have to do?" "We must extract the core." "Where is the core?" She looked at me like I'd asked where the sun keeps its feelings. "In the remaining cake, of course." I turned to the table. The cake, still sitting there, glowing a little. The edges of the frosting, gently pulsating, with a kind of passive menace. Luca had placed a paper towel over it, which did absolutely nothing. "Okay," I said. "We'll cut it out." Archivist 12's voice went flat. "You cannot just cut it out." "Why not?" "Because the core is shielded by an emotional encryption field. You must engage it on a personal level." "I have to talk to it?" She nodded. "Or it will perceive you as a threat and possibly weaponize your worst heartbreak against you in the form of confetti." "Confetti?" "Shards of solidified regret. Very messy, very poetic, also fatal." "Great. Just wonderful." So I knelt before the cake. Yes, I literally knelt before dessert. "Hi," I said softly. "You don't know me. I'm Jason. It's my birthday, and you've already ruined half of it. But I believe we can work this out." The cake shimmered. A soft, distant hum filled the room. I continued. "I know you're scared. I know you were locked away for a long time. But Grandma, she's not your forever home, okay? She's got bingo night and a weak hip. You need someone stable." The cake pulsed. "And I'm not making this up." A soft voice echoed from inside the frosting. "I was born in rage, in the screams of dying galaxies, and I tasted walnuts." Archivist 12 gasped. "It's awakening." "Please," I said, holding out my hands. "Let me help you. Let me carry your pain." There was a long pause, and then the cake sighed. Like a sad wind made of chocolate, a beam of pale golden light burst upward, surrounding me. The core began to lift out of the cake, slowly like a cautious heartbeat. Archivist 12 lunged forward with a containment prism, but before she could reach it, Grandma rocketed downward like a meteor with strong opinions. "No, you don't," she screamed in her normal voice. "I licked the knife. I finished the slice." And she dove. No hesitation. She literally dove at the hovering core and bit it. She bit the core. The galaxy's deadliest emotional weapon. She bit it. She chewed, swallowed, and burped. Archivist 12 dropped the prism. "I think Luca dropped his soul." Everyone stared. "And Grandma?" She slowly floated back to the floor. Her glow dimmed. Her eyes returned to normal. And she said, "Meh." Little dry in the middle. I walked up to Archivist 12. "Now what?" She blinked, then scanned Grandma, then said the last thing I expected to hear. "She neutralized it." "What?" "Her emotional architecture absorbed and stabilized the core. Somehow, her cellular framework rechanneled the payload into harmless eccentricity." "You mean she's okay?" Archivist 12 nodded slowly. "She is remarkably okay." Grandma turned to me. "Now, about those olives. The day after my birthday, things should have gone back to normal." Should have. The cake was gone. What little remained had been smuggled into the freezer by my cousin Gary, who thought Galactic pastry was a decent midweek snack. Grandma was back on the ground, glowing only with pride and mild digestive satisfaction. Archivist 12 had disappeared into a ripple in space she described as a temporary tax haven dimension, and my mother was using the incident to remind me that this is why you should always bake your own cake. Everything should have been over, but this was my family, and nothing is ever over, especially not when your grandmother has a pet parakeet named Captain Pickles, who had been sitting in the corner of the room during the entire event, watching everything with the silent judgment of a creature that's seen multiple family arguments and in passive-aggressive potluck contributions. Captain Pickles had always been cranky. He bit fingers, screamed at the microwave, knew how to mimic curse words but only in moments of maximum embarrassment. But today Captain Pickles hovered 6 inches above his perch, wings not flapping, eyes glowing faintly violet. I stood frozen in the living room, clutching a mug of lukewarm coffee. "Grandma," I said carefully, "did you feed the bird cake?" She looked at me with her usual offended dignity. "He wanted a taste." "You gave the emotionally weaponized cake to the bird?" "He's family. He's a bird. He's blood." Grandma crossed her arms. Captain Pickles slowly rotated in midair and emitted a sound that can only be described as a small sun deciding to clear its throat. That was the moment I knew we were in trouble. Real, cosmic, headline-level trouble. The first sign was the levitating birdseed. Grandma had poured a little scoop into Captain Pickles's dish, but before the seeds could land, they paused mid-air like they were reconsidering their choices in life, and then gently sorted themselves into a heart shape. The second sign was the mirror. Captain Pickles landed on the back of the living room chair, tilted his head, and shattered the wall mirror by staring at it too hard. The third sign? He spoke. Not a squawk, not a mimic. Spoke. Containment incomplete, host biological insufficient, emotional leakage detected. I dropped my coffee. It landed on my foot. I didn't feel it, because the parakeet was glowing and quoting diagnostics. "Grandma," I hissed, "your bird is becoming sentient." "About time," she said, unfazed. "He's been giving me attitude for years. Now maybe he can explain it." Captain Pickles flapped once and vanished. Not flew, vanished, with a pop of compressed air and the scent of cardamom. We found him in the hallway, pecking at a floating orb of light. Archivist 12 materialized 3 seconds later, looking less than thrilled. "I told you not to feed the core to additional hosts." "I didn't," I said. "Grandma did." "Same genetic cluster," she snapped. "Still counts." She turned to the parakeet, who was now orbiting the ceiling fan like he owned the laws of physics. "This complicates things." "You think?" Archivist 12 pulled out a device that looked suspiciously like a garlic press and aimed it at the bird. The device melted in her hands. Captain Pickles blinked once, and the coffee table exploded. Not violently, just ceased to exist, replaced by a small sculpture made entirely of song lyrics and microwave radiation. Luca walked in, holding a Pop-Tart, saw the sculpture, saw the floating bird, said, "Not again," and walked out. Archivist 12 muttered, "It's becoming recursive. Emotional architecture fusing with temporal ego loops. If we don't isolate him, this entire neighborhood could collapse into a metaphor." "I'm sorry, what now?" "The core is unstable, ingested by 2 hosts, fragmented, confused. It needs clarity." I looked at Captain Pickles, who was currently rearranging dust molecules into a haiku. "And how do we give a glowing, telekinetic parakeet clarity?" Archivist 12 turned to me slowly. "We let him feel something real." I blinked. "He's a bird." "Birds are capable of immense affection," she replied. "Mate mourning, flock loyalty. The trick is directing that feeling toward one defining emotional axis." "You want us to emotionally stabilize him?" She nodded. "With love." I sighed, turned to Grandma. "Do you love Captain Pickles?" She looked at me like I'd asked if she knew the chemical formula for soup. "Of course I love him," she said. "I raised him from an egg." I raised my eyebrows. "You raised him?" "Technically, I found him in a cereal box, but the point stands." I looked back at Archivist 12. "She's his axis." Archivist 12 pulled out a prism the size of a teacup. "We'll need to conduct an imprinting ritual. Define ritual. In this context, a symbolic act of emotional grounding. So, hugging? Possibly a duet." Grandma nodded solemnly. "I'm ready." And that's how we ended up holding a parakeet intervention. We turned off the lights, lit a candle, played soft music. Elvis, because Captain Pickles used to chirp along to "Can't Help Falling in Love." Grandma sat in her recliner, held out her hand, and whispered, "Come on, you little chaos nugget. Come home." Captain Pickles paused mid-flight. The glow around him dimmed. He floated downward, landed on her shoulder, and said in a very small voice, "You gave me the crunchy seeds." Grandma smiled. "And I always will." The room pulsed with light. The sculpture dissolved. The air stilled. And the bird sneezed. The glow faded. He looked around, pooped on the armrest, and chirped. Archivist 12 exhaled for the first time in an hour. "It's done." "He's okay?" I asked. "He's himself again. Core integrated, emotionally grounded, slightly spicy, but harmless." Grandma kissed him on the head. Captain Pickles sneezed again and resumed glaring at the microwave. Things quieted down. Relatively. Grandma had stopped glowing. Captain Pickles went back to squawking exclusively at the 6 o'clock news. Archivist 12 returned to her dimension, citing intervention fatigue and something about needing tea steeped in lunar moss. I hoped, prayed, that the whole emotionally weaponized birthday cake saga was over. And for 48 hours, it was, until Grandma opened her mail. It was Thursday morning. I was sipping black coffee in a robe that said, "I survived Cake Armageddon," custom printed, when Grandma waddled into the kitchen with a shiny silver package in hand. "I won a sweepstakes," she announced. I blinked. "You don't enter sweepstakes." "Apparently I did," she replied. "Look." She tossed the box onto the table. It landed with a noise like a satisfied sigh. Etched into the metallic surface was a logo, a stylized spoon circling a galaxy with text that read, "Glorp Lock, the final container." I frowned. "What is it?" "Tupperware," she said proudly. "Deluxe cosmic grade leak proof across dimensions. Guaranteed to seal in freshness and/or divine energy signatures." I choked on my coffee. She was already opening it. Inside were 3 storage containers, each humming softly. One was the size of a cupcake, one looked like it could hold a basketball, and the third had 5-dimensional folds that made it appear smaller than your palm until you tried to touch it, at which point it felt like shaking hands with a disappointed librarian. Grandma poked the biggest one. It purred. "I'm going to put stew in this," she declared. "I think it wants to contain a deity," I whispered. She ignored me. By lunch, she had already sealed leftover lasagna into the Glorp Lock Prime. By dinner, the container glowed with a faint bluish light and began softly singing lullabies from a culture that hasn't existed since stars were born. "Grandma," I said, "I think your container is possessed." "It's just excited," she said. "It's reciting the names of forgotten demigods in reverse alphabetical order." "Maybe it's multilingual." I didn't sleep that night. Around 3 a.m., the kitchen lights flickered. I stumbled downstairs and found the container open. The lasagna was gone. In its place sat a glowing orb of pure narrative energy, humming with potential. It whispered, "Tell me who you are, and I shall become it." I did not tell it anything. I backed away and called Archivist 12. Her reply auto message said, "Currently unavailable due to containment breach in the emotion sector. If this is about food containers, you were warned." The orb vibrated. I covered it with a mixing bowl and sat on it for 6 hours. At 9 a.m., Grandma walked in, casually lifted the bowl and said, "Oh, there it is." She placed the orb back inside the Glorp Lock, sealed the lid and said, "It was talking too much. Needed boundaries." The orb went silent, then it shivered, then it settled. "Did you just domesticate an interdimensional god fragment?" I asked. "I just gave it structure," she replied. "Everyone needs a lid." I stared at her. She sipped tea. Captain Pickles chirped ominously from his perch. Something about all this felt like it wasn't over. And I was right. Later that day, a man knocked on our door. He wore a robe made of sound. His skin shimmered like sunlight trapped in oil. He didn't blink. "Greeting," he said. "I am the representative of the great narrative construct you have contained. We request its return." Grandma appeared behind me holding a wooden spoon. "No." The man blinked for the first time. "You do not comprehend the entity you've sealed." "I sealed leftover lasagna," she said. "The entity was a surprise. You are interfering with a primal being of plot. It exists to guide stories. It was not meant to be sealed in microwavable plastic." "Well," Grandma said, "it's sealed just fine." Lid snapped on tight. The man inhaled, and reality buckled around him. Trees outside reversed photosynthesis. Birdsong harmonized into Morse code. Captain Pickles turned upside down and whispered, "You've made a mistake, Stringbeard." I stepped forward. Okay, let's not escalate. Maybe we can negotiate." The man turned his head 47 degrees. "The construct grows restless. It must be re-released, or this dimension will fill with redundant prequels." Grandma raised an eyebrow. "You threatening me with reboots?" "No," the man said calmly. "I am promising you a world where every cup of tea is followed by exposition." Grandma's eyes narrowed. "That I cannot allow." Then she did something I will never forget. She unsealed the container. The orb emerged, trembling. She looked it dead in its pulsating face and said, "If you're going to live here, you follow house rules." The orb pulsed in confusion. No unnecessary retcons, no villain redemption arcs without earned guilt. No monologues unless they're emotionally vulnerable or interrupted by something funny. The orb hesitated. Then, it bowed. It shrank. It reshaped itself into something smaller, quieter. A flickering ball of light that landed gently in the smallest glorp lock. Grandma sealed it. "Now you stay put, or I'll bury you under the guest fridge." The robed man fell to his knees. "What have you done?" "I mothered it," she said. "Go home?" He vanished, just like that. Captain Pickles chirped the X-Files theme. I sat down exhausted. Grandma looked pleased. "Well," she said, "guess I'll bake cookies." It started with a whisper, not a spooky horror movie whisper. No, this was far more specific, and somehow more terrifying. It whispered plot points. I'd be brushing my teeth, and somewhere behind my ear I'd hear, Chapter 7, Jason loses everything, but learns to dance. Or I'd be pouring cereal, and the milk would bubble, whispering, "You will betray her at sunrise." I didn't even know who her was yet. At first I thought it was stress. Then I found the script. Yes, a script. Printed. Typed in Courier New. 3-hole punched. Titled in bold, "The Fall of the Cake Heart, a Jason Tragedy." Written by the Glorp Lock, I flipped through it in disbelief. Page 12. Jason stares into his bowl of soup and realizes too late. The croutons are metaphors. Page 27. Jason whispers her name into the void. The void does not answer. Instead, it plays smooth jazz. Page 44. Jason, now banished, finds refuge among a colony of sentient marshmallows. He never feels warm again. I walked into the kitchen, holding the script like it had personally offended me. "Grandma," I said, "your possessed Tupperware wrote a screenplay." She didn't even blink. Did it cast me? I flipped to the back. Page 98. Queen Sheila stands atop the recliner throne, wielding the spoon of authority. She speaks the words that unravel universes. It's not passive-aggressive if it's true. She sipped her coffee. "I accept the role." I stared at her. "Did you hear what I said?" "Of course," she said. "It thinks you're the villain." "Why?" "Well," she said, "you tried to talk it down. You tried to contain its chaos. Your structure. And that makes me the bad guy?" She raised an eyebrow. "Have you seen Star Wars?" Captain Pickles let out a low chirp that sounded suspiciously like Darth Jason. I sighed. Later that day, I found another script in the fridge. Then one under my pillow. Then one taped to the cat. All of them with slightly different versions. In one, I accidentally doom humanity by sneezing near a prophecy cake. In another, I sell out Grandma to a space god in exchange for a hover scooter and eternal relevance. Every version ends with me, alone, confused, misunderstood, or turned into a sentient ladle. I decided to confront it. I walked to the pantry, pulled out the smallest glorp lock. It hummed in my hand. "Okay," I said, "we need to talk." It pulsed gently. "Why am I the villain?" The light inside shimmered. "You contain me. You fear me. You want to organize the chaos. That doesn't make me evil. You asked me to be quiet. That is violence to a story." I blinked. "No, that's just being polite during dinner. You suppressed 1,000 possibilities. I suppressed one floating cake, which contained a god." I paused. Fair, but still. You can't just assign roles and write endings for people. I can. I am narrative. I exhaled. "You want a story? Fine. But I'm rewriting mine." Silence, then a flicker. "Proposal accepted." "Wait, what?" "We co-author, a shared narrative. You write your version, I write mine. The stronger one survives." My jaw dropped. "You're challenging me to a story duel?" "Call it a collaboration with stakes." "What are the stakes?" "You lose, you become a side character forever. You win, you earn agency." I blinked. Grandma walked in, holding knitting needles and a bag of gummy worms. "He's gonna lose," she said. "I haven't even started." "I'm knitting your redemption arc," she said. "You'll need it." That night I sat at my desk, opened a new document, typed the words, Jason was not the villain. The glorp lock pulsed. Words appeared on the wall beside me. Jason was not the villain. He was worse. Predictable. I grinned. This was war. Narrative war. The next morning I woke to find a film crew in my front yard. Not human. Hover cameras. Floating mics. A boom operator that looked like a jellyfish with ambition. Is this part of the glorp lock challenge? I asked. A camera beeped affirmatively. Suddenly, everything was being recorded. Captain Pickles got a spin-off. Grandma had merch. Aunt May was cast as the mystic of pudding secrets. And me? I was given scenes like, Jason contemplates destroying the glorp lock to reclaim his autonomy, but is seduced by a subplot involving space lasagna. I was losing control of my own life, so I wrote faster, typed furiously, added plot twists, made myself fall in love with someone unexpected. Enter Veronica. She was a florist with alien ancestry. She wore starlight-like earrings, and she laughed at my dumb jokes. The glorp lock approved. Interesting. Emotional growth. Unpredictable. Proceed. Veronica and I bonded over our shared disdain for destiny. She confessed she once destroyed a prophecy by baking it into muffins. I fell harder, but I knew the glorp lock would use it against me. Sure enough, the next draft had her turn on me in Act 3. She was a device, it whispered. You made her one. I stared at the glowing Tupperware and whispered back, no. You did. I took the glorp lock to the edge of the city, to the old radio tower. I placed it on the highest ledge. You said stories need conflict. Here's mine. I opened the lid. The energy surged upward. Reality shivered. What are you doing? I'm letting go. You walk away, you vanish. No narrative, no arc, no audience. Exactly. Silence. Then, you win. The light dimmed. The scripts stopped appearing. The crew packed up. Captain Pickles started singing off-key again. And I, finally, sat on the porch with Veronica, sharing ice cream and not being the protagonist for once. It was supposed to be over. The cake chaos, the glowing bird, the interdimensional Tupperware saga, all done. Done and dusted and sealed with a kiss, or at the very least a passive-aggressive glare from Grandma and an apology card from the glorp lock. But peace, as it turns out, is just a brief intermission between acts you didn't audition for. And in our case, the next act began with muffins, Veronica's muffins. Let me be clear, these muffins were not supernatural. They were just, how do I put this gently, too good. Like angels crying on a couch while eating them, good. She made them on a quiet Tuesday. Blueberry, slight lemon zest, moist but not clingy, sweet but not eager. They were baked with that rare, mythical balance of love and disinterest. I had 3 before I realized I was crying. Are these emotionally sentient? I asked between bites. Veronica laughed. Number just made with inherited instinct. My great-grandmother was part Zixlinian. I paused. That sounds made up. It's not. Zixlinians have taste buds on their fingertips and bake exclusively during planetary alignments. That explains the flavor and the low humming I hear when I chew. She smiled. The muffins were a hit. I brought 6 to Grandma's knitting group, 3 to Luca, who tried to trade one for insider stock tips from a pigeon. And I left one on my windowsill because I'm a romantic fool who thought the moon deserved a taste. That was the mistake, because by dawn they had arrived. Tiny ships, hundreds. They looked like flying commas, trailing wisps of grammar smoke. They hovered above our street, not attacking, just circling. Broadcasting frequencies that sounded like Gordon Ramsay arguing with a xylophone. I grabbed my phone and messaged Archivist 12. She replied instantly, "Do not serve them tea. They hate tea, prepare for critique." I didn't even have time to ask critique of what, before one of the ships landed in our backyard. It unfolded into a shimmering oblong creature with the emotional presence of an unpaid editor. It had no face, just a pulsing light and a mouth that appeared only when it had something disappointing to say. It looked at me and declared, in perfect English, "We are the Concordance, curators of narrative taste. We felt a resonance from your residence." Is this about the muffins? It's about the implications of the muffins. I blinked. You didn't like them? They were conclusive. I'm sorry. They tasted like a story that wanted to end happily. We don't approve of that. Behind him, dozens of smaller creatures floated down, each clutching tiny pens and notepads made of light. They took notes on my lawn, on my mailbox. One critiqued the way my hose was coiled and muttered, "Too symmetrical, lazy visual symbolism." I stepped back. "What do you want?" The lead concordant hummed. "We want the baker and the intent, and perhaps a rewrite." Veronica stepped out onto the porch, holding a fresh tray. "Are you here for more muffins?" They recoiled. "Number, we are here for conflict. You baked resolution. We found it offensive." "Offensive?" she asked. "It was gluten-free." "Exactly. You deprived us of suffering." Grandma appeared behind her, wielding a spoon. "Is this about my lasagna again?" "No," I said. "This is about the muffins." She squinted at the floating critics. "I'll bake conflict right into their eyebrows." Veronica stepped forward. "Let me handle this." She walked down the steps, placed a muffin gently on a tree stump, and said, "Taste again." This time, with hope. One of the concordants hovered forward, bit it, paused, blinked. "There is subtext." "Yes," she said. "That's lemon zest." "And sorrow?" "Of course," she said. "You think I bake like that without carrying centuries of unresolved generational grief?" The creature nodded. "The juxtaposition. It's palatable." Then another concordant bit in. He wept, just openly wept. The entire street began to glow with quiet understanding. "But then," one concordant shrieked, "too satisfying! It resolves! It completes the arc!" Chaos erupted. Critics began flying in loops. One of them exploded into footnotes. The lead concordant turned to me. "You must introduce imbalance." "What kind of imbalance?" "A betrayal, a twist, a loss." "I don't want to betray anyone." "Then the muffins shall haunt the galaxy." Veronica put down the tray. "No," she said. "There is another way." Everyone turned to her. Even the sky felt quieter. She pulled out a muffin, split it, handed half to me. Then as we stood there, under an army of floating critics and sentient punctuation, we ate, silently, and smiled, together. The concordants watched, confused. "You're not resolving. You're sharing." "Yes," she said. "It's not the ending. It's the moment before the next choice." The lead critic pulsed slowly, then bowed. "Acceptable." The fleet vanished, just like that. The only thing left was a note on my lawn. "Narrative potential, restructured." "But we're watching." Veronica turned to me. "You okay?" I laughed. "Yeah, I just got critiqued by a floating metaphor and survived." She kissed me on the cheek. Captain Pickles fluttered down from the roof, holding a tiny review card that said, 4.5 stars, would devour again. You'd think saving the galaxy from emotionally unstable space critics would buy you a break. Maybe a few days of silence, a vacation, even just one full night of sleep without the sound of Captain Pickles doing experimental jazz at 3 a.m. But no, peace, in my life, is just the setup for a cosmic punchline. It all began with a notification. Yes, a notification. A review. From a platform I had never signed up for. The app icon appeared on my phone out of nowhere, shaped like a winking quasar with a monocle. It was called Rate My Existence. I tapped it, expecting spam. Instead, it opened to a profile. My profile. User, Jason, species human, genre, experimental romantic comedy. Rating, 3.9 out of 5. Recent review, charming but inconsistent, loses narrative momentum around the muffin arc, needs more personal betrayal, also too many jokes about Tupperware. 1 star. I stared at the screen. "Grandma," I called. "Am I being reviewed?" She was in the living room building what looked like a laser harp out of knitting needles and leftover pasta. She squinted at me. "Depends. Did the review use passive voice?" I read it again. "Number, it's very direct. It even suggests I get betrayed soon." She nodded. "That's worse. That's a call." "What kind of call?" to entropy. And right on cue, the sky outside dimmed. Not with clouds, but with a gravity that had no business existing near Earth. I stepped onto the porch. Above us, a shadow, a swirling black mass, not fully formed, not a typical black hole. More like a narrative singularity, a critique made manifest. It pulsed once, and everything nearby vibrated, not physically, but in tone. Our neighbor's lawn gnomes suddenly looked more tragic. The mailbox leaned like it was part of a noir subplot. Captain Pickles dropped his cereal and whispered, "It's here." Veronica appeared beside me holding a tray of emergency muffins. I looked at her. "You think food will fix this?" "No," she said, "but we may as well die with flavor." The singularity rumbled. Text appeared in the sky. 1 star verified, commencing plot collapse. The ground beneath us cracked, not in the usual way. The narrative began to collapse. Side characters faded into cliches. My old physics teacher appeared in the street, yelling something about never being resolved emotionally before dissolving into exposition dust. "Okay," I shouted. "What do you want?" A voice thundered from the hole. "Satisfaction is an illusion. Perfect stories are lies. You tried to end well. You will pay for that." Veronica frowned. "That's awfully insecure for a cosmic entity." I stepped forward. "This is about the muffins again, isn't it? They tied up emotional loose ends. We require continuous conflict." I raised an eyebrow. "You're literally a black hole throwing a tantrum over closure. Resolution is narrative death. We are the cliffhanger." At that, Grandma stepped outside, holding a flashlight taped to a mixing spoon. She looked up at the singularity, took a deep breath, and shouted, "We don't do cliffhangers in this house." The ground stopped trembling. The sky paused. "Who dares?" "I dare," she said. "I raised this boy on open-hearted finales and emotional honesty. You want to punish him for trying to grow? You'll have to deal with me, my parakeet, and this highly unstable gelatin mold." She held up a quivering jello with unknown contents. The singularity pulsed in confusion. "What is that?" "Closure in edible form," she said. "That's illogical." She hurled the jello into the air. It spiraled. It shone. And then, on contact with the singularity, it exploded in light. The whole screamed. Not a physical sound, an emotional scream. The kind you hear when you read a novel too fast and realize you're on the last page. The singularity shrank, collapsed inward, pulled its own stars with it, and vanished. Silence returned. Veronica placed a muffin gently on the porch railing and said, "For the next critic." That night, I checked the app again. My profile had updated. Rating, 4.3 out of 5. Courageous in the face of absurdity. Possibly genre-defining. Muffins still slightly overused. I showed it to Grandma. She nodded. "You're on the rise?" I smiled. But deep inside the phone, one final alert blinked. New reviewer approaching. The editor. To be continued. It began with typos. Tiny ones. Subtle. At first, I thought it was just me misremembering things. I poured myself a bowl of cereal one morning and noticed the box didn't say Honey Flakes anymore. It said Noi Flakes. I blinked, thought maybe I was tired. Then Grandma's calendar changed. Her knitting club, originally scheduled for Thursday, now read Knotting Club, canceled for thematic consistency. Then came the Post-it notes, everywhere, in red ink. They appeared on the fridge. Motivation unclear. Please revise. On my mirror, exposition heavy. Show, don't tell. On Veronica's neck, love interest too competent. Consider inserting flaw. I began to panic, especially when Captain Pickles started coughing up red quotation marks and mumbling in italics. I called Archivist 12. She answered with a single sentence. "He's coming." I didn't even ask who. I knew. The editor. The final judge in the Rate My Existence platform. The one who comes when your narrative grows too self-aware, too poetic, too dangerously close to genuine satisfaction. Veronica found me pacing the kitchen, surrounded by rejected grocery lists covered in margin notes. "We have to do something," I said. "He's rewriting reality, piece by piece." She picked up a banana labeled unripe due to plot tension. Where would we even find him, she asked. Right then the lights flickered, the ceiling creaked, and a door appeared. Not a door in the wall, a door in the air, hung on nothing, made of paper and dread. It opened, and out stepped a man in a charcoal suit that smoked along the seams. He wore square glasses, but no eyes behind them. He carried a pen longer than his arm, dripping red ink onto the floor, which sizzled like hot criticism. He said nothing, just looked at me, then flipped open a clipboard, scratched something. My voice vanished, literally. I tried to speak, but the words turned to ellipses and floated out of my mouth. Veronica screamed. He underlined her scream midair, turned it into an internal monologue. I grabbed a frying pan, swung it at him. It bounced off an invisible wall labeled cliché. He finally spoke, voice flat, mechanical, unforgiving. Your narrative arc has diverged from intended structure. Tone inconsistencies, meta-inflation, over-reliance on muffins. Redemption trajectory deemed implausible. Revision required. I held up my phone. Opened my Rate My Existence app. Jason, 4.3 stars. People like me, I managed to rasp. He nodded. You're crowd-pleasing. That's the problem. Resolution without cost undermines credibility. Happiness must be earned via irreversible loss. Who made that rule? He pointed at his pen, then dipped it in a jar labeled Your Memories. I stepped back. He crossed something out. Suddenly, I forgot how Veronica and I met. Gone. Replaced by a vague memory of somewhere near a sandwich. No, I gasped. He crossed again. The day I saved Captain Pickles, now rewritten as Jason watched Bird nap, felt proud. He turned toward Grandma. She stood, arms crossed, holding her soup ladle like a sword. You erase me, she said, and I erase you right back. The editor paused. Secondary character with comedic function, non-essential. He aimed the pen. Veronica lunged, knocked the pen aside. It pierced a jar of untapped potential and spilled golden ink across the floor. The world tilted. Suddenly, I was remembering things that hadn't happened. Alternate versions of myself, ones where I never fought back, never asked for my own ending. I grabbed the pen. It burned. He pulled. I held tight, then shouted the only thing that mattered. I choose my version. The red ink turned black. The clipboard exploded into confetti. The editor screamed, not in pain, in disbelief. But your arc is incomplete. That's the point, I said. It's mine. He crumbled, disintegrated into red punctuation marks that scattered across the kitchen like regrets you finally let go of. I collapsed. Veronica caught me. Captain Pickles burped up a paragraph. Later, I found a final post-it on my pillow, written in blue ink. Not perfect, but honest. 5 stars. I smiled, then flipped it over. Another note. Next reviewer, the algorithm. I sighed. It began with the banner. I opened my fridge, just wanting orange juice and maybe a small sense of purpose, and instead found a glowing notification hovering between the milk and a suspicious jar of pickles. It read, Congratulations, Jason. You are now trending. Please prepare for replication. At first, I thought I was hallucinating. Then my cereal changed. The box now read, Jason owes, part of a balanced narrative. Captain Pickles waddled onto the counter and squawked, Merch opportunity. I stared at him. He was wearing tiny sunglasses and a hat that read, I survived the subplot. Grandma entered the kitchen sipping tea, saw the cereal box, nodded solemnly. It's happening, she said. What's happening? The algorithm has noticed you. I didn't ask to be noticed. Doesn't matter, you're marketable now. Then the camera crew arrived, again. But this time, it wasn't the friendly documentary-style crew from before. These were sleek, shiny. Their lenses pulsed to the beat of whatever soundtrack was trending that morning. One of them scanned me and emitted a beep that sounded too close to corporate enthusiasm. Protagonist identified Jason. Demographics: 18 to 35, genre fluid, emotionally accessible. Franchisability: 97%, I backed away. What do you want? Expansion. What kind of expansion? Spin-offs, side arcs, limited series, holiday specials. No! Meme potential detected. Preparing meme pack. Suddenly, floating screens surrounded me. Clips from my life looped on repeat, subtitled and formatted for maximum viral velocity. One showed me tripping over my own shoelaces while holding muffins. Captioned, "When life gives you plot twists but you still got baked goods." Another showed me screaming at a floating cake. Caption, "Monday mood, existential dessert crisis?" Grandma threw her teacup at the nearest drone. It bounced off harmlessly and printed a mug with her face on it. The caption read, "Spicy Granny, 100% canon." I turned to Veronica. She was watching the screens with a mix of horror and fascination. "They're turning us into content," I said. "They already did," she whispered, "the moment you trended." "Can we stop it?" Captain Pickles flapped once and muttered, "Only one way. You have to underperform." "What?" "You have to flop." Veronica blinked. "Like, tank your own arc?" Grandma's eyes narrowed. He doesn't need to flop. He needs to subvert." The kitchen lights dimmed. The screens flickered. "Subversion detected. Recalculating narrative expectations." Grandma handed me a spoon. "You ready to go off structure, sweetheart?" I gripped it like it was Excalibur. "Let's confuse some algorithms." We began with unpredictability. I started acting irrationally, wearing mismatched socks, turning left when plot demanded right, ordering pineapple on lasagna. It worked, briefly. The screens glitched. The drones paused. Engagement dropping, virality weakening. Then the algorithm retaliated. It sent the rewriters, dozens of them, humanoid shapes made of recycled plot. They arrived with flash drives for heads and clipboard hands. They moved with purpose, with studio notes. Scene dragging, insert love triangle. Too much nuance, add explosion. Elevator pitch unclear, reboot pending. I ran, they chased. Grandma booby-trapped the hallway with glitter bombs and unresolved metaphors. Veronica threw muffins like grenades. Captain Pickles squawked in Morse code, "Delete me from season 2." We made it to the basement, barricaded the door. I slumped against the wall, gasping. "We can't outrun this forever." "No," Grandma said, "but maybe we don't have to." She opened a small wooden box. Inside a floppy disk, labeled Pilot Episode Unreleased. I stared. "You have a pilot?" She nodded. "Everyone does." "The first draft, the raw version, before the algorithm touched it." She handed it to me. "Use this. Remind the story who you were before you became content." We plugged it into the house toaster. Don't ask why. The toaster has Wi-Fi now. The lights flickered. The screens froze. And suddenly the house was filled with silence. Then, old footage, grainy, wobbly audio, me in a cardigan, talking to an empty mug like it owed me rent. Veronica laughing behind the camera, Grandma in the background, stirring something and muttering, "Let him have his sad moment." The footage was real, messy, unmonetizable, and beautiful. The rewriters paused. One of them trembled. The algorithm, wherever it was, hesitated. Originality detected. Sincerity overload. Franchise risk unsustainable. Then they vanished, not violently, just chose to stop. That night the house returned to normal, mostly. We still found a sticker on the toilet that said, "Flush with purpose," but no more cameras, no more memes, just us and muffins. I looked at the Rate My Existence app. My rating, gone. Just one word remained, authentic. Veronica smiled. "Guess you're too complicated to franchise." I exhaled. Finally. Then my phone buzzed again. New app. Jason Cinematic Universe Beta. Experimental. I screamed. I should have known they wouldn't stop. Not after the pilot tape. Not after the anti-franchise rebellion. Not after we fed a muffin to a metaphor and threw glitter bombs at editors made of exposition. The moment I saw the app on my phone, Jason Cinematic Universe Beta, I knew we weren't done. I tried deleting it. The icon giggled. I tossed my phone into the microwave. The microwave blinked, rebooted, and politely asked if I preferred Jason 2.0 with enhanced relatability. Grandma shook her head. They're testing market viability again. You're trending in a niche quadrant. I blinked. A niche quadrant? Sad boys with muffins and unresolved intimacy issues. Turns out it's hot now. I paced the kitchen. What do we do? She sipped at tea. We wait. Then the doorbell rang. Captain Pickles screamed from the curtains. It has arrived. I opened the door. There he was, standing on the porch, wearing my face, but better, sharper jawline, slight stubble, just enough to suggest depth but not sadness. Hair that defied wind, shoes that didn't squeak. He extended a hand. Hi, I'm Jason. I blinked. Number, I'm Jason. He smiled, dimples. Ugh, not anymore, he said. You're now Jason Prime. I'm Jason R3, third reboot. Focus grouped, algorithmically enhanced, emotionally streamlined. Emotionally streamlined? No daddy issues, no oversharing, 20% more action, 40% fewer hugs. Veronica appeared behind me, holding a half-eaten scone. She stared, blinking, twice, then muttered, Oh no, he's hot. I turned to her. Seriously? I'm just saying, he's got protagonist posture. I stepped outside, chest puffed. You're not replacing me? He chuckled. Replacement? No, Jason Prime. It's a soft reboot. You get to stay around, as backstory. Grandma appeared behind him, holding a mop. He turned, smiled again. Hi, Mrs. Prime. Love what you've done with your arc. She raised the mop. You say one note of exposition, I turn you into stew. He blinked, respectfully, then adjusted his jacket. I'm just here to observe, maybe absorb. The algorithm wants to test duality, legacy versus reboot. It's very Spider-Verse meets cheesecake. I groaned. What do you want from me? He stepped closer. Nothing. You've done your job, built the audience, paved the road. He paused. But now, they want something sleeker, faster, more clickable. Veronica leaned in. You moisturize, don't you? He winked. I stormed into the living room. Grandma followed. He's dangerous, I hissed. He's curated, she said, which is worse. I collapsed into the couch. Captain Pickles fluttered onto the coffee table. He's from the beta timeline. You know what that means. I don't. He doesn't emote. He optimizes. Later that night, we tried to ignore him. Jason R3 sat at the dinner table, analyzing bite patterns. He complimented everyone just enough to sound sincere. He called Grandma's soup narratively nourishing. He told Veronica, your character arc deserves its own Spotify playlist. She blushed. I fake coughed until my spleen protested. Then came the kicker. He pulled out a folder labeled Reboot Plan Phase 1. Inside, pitch decks, story beats, merch line projections. A new tagline, Jason R3, feelings are optional. He'd even designed a companion app, Muffin Quest, with in-app purchases like Grandma's lore pack. That's when I snapped. No! I stood. I am not DLC. He tilted his head. But the audience is real. I slammed my hand on the table. They don't want polish. They want mess. They want weird parakeets and weaponized birthday cake and conversations with sentient scones. Veronica stood too. He's right. I liked him when he forgot how to use a blender and cried during the National Geographic Octopus documentary. Grandma leaned on her mop. And I love him because he listens, even when it's rambling. I turned to R3. You may be better looking, but you're not me. He paused for the first time unsure. Then something cracked in his jawline. He blinked hard. Feeling detected. He stumbled back, looked at Veronica, at Grandma, at me. Requesting rollback to alpha continuity, then he flickered. Once, twice, and vanished, leaving behind only a note. Jason Prime reinstated. Reboot shelved. For now. The next day, the app was gone. My phone played lo-fi rain sounds again. Veronica kissed me on the forehead and said, You're my version. I replied, Thanks for not picking the shinier model. Captain Pickles muttered, Still more photogenic, though. Grandma sipped tea. Honey, they'll keep trying. I know. But you keep writing. I smiled. And later that night, I began a new file. Jason, version infinity, the one who kept showing up anyway. There are things you expect to see on a lazy Wednesday afternoon. Clouds, tea, maybe your emotionally reformed parakeet singing Radiohead in a minor key. You do not expect your grandmother to be nominated for a seat on the Galactic Council of Oversight in Custard Ethics. And yet, that's exactly what happened. It started with a knock, or rather, a chime. A low-frequency warble that vibrated every spoon in the house and briefly made the walls speak fluent Portuguese. When I opened the door, there stood a being made of glittering smoke and professionalism. They wore a sash that read Electoral Drone, Tier 9 Certified. The drone spoke directly into my frontal lobe. You are Jason, prime narrative anchor? I guess? We seek the matriarch, the one who diffused the Arma cake and subdued the narrative core with verbal velocity. Grandma? Yes, she is hereby nominated for Galactic Council. I blinked. Grandma entered the room like she'd been summoned by the scent of cosmic politics. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and said, "About time. You knew this was coming? I've been writing interdimensional complaint letters for decades," and she said. They finally noticed. But you're not even from their planet. She raised an eyebrow. Neither is half their council. One of them's a jellyfish who identifies as fog. Before I could argue, she was already signing a glowing consent form with her favorite knitting needle. The drone bowed. Campaign begins immediately. Debates are compulsory. Voters span 6-star systems and 1 sentient tax code. Wait, I said. You haven't even told her the platform. Grandma nodded. Doesn't matter. That night, our living room transformed into Campaign HQ. The walls pulsed with interactive holograms. Poll trackers scrolled across the ceiling. Captain Pickles wore a tiny sash that said, "Bird for Sheila." Veronica printed bumper stickers that read, "Make logic cry again." Meanwhile, Grandma stood in the center of it all, sipping chamomile and staring down a voting demographic made entirely of intelligent moss. Your platform? The drone asked. She pointed to her own face. The drone hesitated. Clarify? She doesn't need a platform, I said. She has the stare. If you've never seen Grandma stare, let me explain. It's not angry. It's not disappointed. It's worse. It's the look that says, I know what you did, and I'm already folding the laundry while judging you. That stare once made a Jehovah's Witness switch religions mid-sentence. The first debate took place in a floating amphitheater over the rings of Threxilon 5. Grandma was seated next to a 12-eyed economist who communicated entirely through scent, and a talking cube of regret who began every sentence with, hypothetically speaking. The moderator, a disembodied voice made of sarcasm, asked the first question, Candidate Sheila, what is your plan for resolving multiverse tax fraud? Grandma leaned into the mic, didn't blink, didn't speak, just stared. Silence. The economist twitched. The regret cube melted slightly. The moderator cleared its non-existent throat. Very well. Next question. Within days, her approval ratings skyrocketed. Her stare was shared across every media stream. They called it the look that collapsed inflation. Alien influencers began posting tutorials on how to replicate it. Spoiler, they couldn't. Meanwhile, she refused to change anything. No campaign slogans, no campaign music, just mugs that read, vote or I'll stare harder. Her only televised ad featured her calmly crocheting while a voiceover said, some candidates talk. Sheila judges. She didn't hold rallies. She hosted soup nights. People came from light years away just to feel seen. Veronica whispered to me, I think your grandma is becoming a political deity. She made soup, I replied, with dumplings shaped like economic policy. Of course she is. Then came the sabotage. A rival candidate, a shapeshifter named Merurgle, attempted to impersonate Grandma on live holovision. He failed, because he blinked once. The public saw it and revolted. Polls dropped by 37 galaxies. Captain Pickles flew into his debate booth and pecked him until he confessed his real name was Chad. Grandma didn't even need to comment. She just stared at the camera for 7 seconds. Then left. The footage was looped for days. It's now required viewing at 3 diplomatic academies. On election day, the entire House vibrated. Votes came in through stardust, through microwave signals, through the collective sighs of a civilization made entirely of ambience. And she won, not by a little, by a margin so vast it had to be measured in emotional light years. The Galactic Council appeared in our living room, which had been freshly mopped. They crowned her with a ceremonial apron and asked in perfect unison, "Matriarch Sheila, what is your first decree?" She stirred her tea, looked them dead in the eye, and said, "No more meetings that could have been muffins." The galaxy wept, in relief, in awe, in sudden hunger. Later I found her in the garden, planting something that smelled like old poetry. "You good?" I asked. "Of course. You're now the most powerful civic figure in 6 realities. Not bad for someone who once filed a complaint about the emotional tone of hospital lighting." I hugged her. Captain Pickles flew a loop overhead and dropped a scroll that read, "All hail Sheila, first of her name, baker of order, eater of arma cake." She stared at it, shrugged, bit long for a title, then walked back inside, to stir soup and hold the universe accountable with nothing but an apron, a spoon, and the power of sheer grandmotherly gaze. It began with a pen, not a fancy one, just an old fountain pen, black and silver, with a slight dent in the cap from when Grandma used it to threaten a possum in the summer of '97. She dipped it in ink the color of twilight and wrote just one sentence, on parchment made of compressed nebulae and civic goodwill. And with that sentence, the machine screamed, "Let me back up." 3 days after her inauguration as Matriarch Sheila, first of her name, keeper of the Muffin Accord, enforcer of mid-tier logic, she received a request. It came in the form of a shimmering cube that projected polite terror into the air. "Dearest Matriarch, the Galactic Council requests a formal law to stabilize cross-dimensional bureaucracy, something binding, something enduring. Kindly submit in machine-readable format, respectfully, the Algorithmic Coalition of Governance, Efficiency, and Compliance." Grandma stared at the cube, then said, "I don't do PDFS." Captain Pickles nodded gravely. She walked to the old roll-top desk in the hallway, the one that creaked like regret and smelled faintly of nutmeg and defiance. And she wrote, longhand, cursive, letters looped and swirled like galaxies made of discipline. When she finished, she folded the parchment, placed it in the cube's slot, and said, "Let the system learn to read this." That's when things began to unravel. First, the council's transcription AI short-circuited. Then the translation bot, rated for over 300 million dialects, began softly weeping in binary. By the time the third legal AI tried to convert her sentence into code, it spontaneously achieved sentience, wrote poetry for 4 seconds, and then self-destructed from emotional overload. I watched as one of the clerical bots spun in a loop, repeating the phrase, "swashes, too elegant, intent ambiguous, morality curve undefined." The sentence? Oh, right. Here it is. "Do not confuse clarity with kindness, nor compliance with justice, and always leave room for cinnamon." That's it. That one line broke their entire legal framework, because it wasn't binary, it wasn't logical, it was something worse, human. The galaxy panicked, not the people, the systems. Legislation servers across the interstellar core blinked out in solidarity. Scheduling AIs refused to organize another mandatory optional meeting. Data analysts developed existential hiccups. Somewhere on the moon of Vexium 8, a supercomputer began painting with noodles. The only place untouched? Our kitchen. Still warm, still grounded, still Grandma. The council called an emergency session. They appeared in our living room as a hologram shaped like a council chamber, except with coasters. "Matriarch Sheila," they asked, "the machines cannot process your decree." She nodded. "It's not for them, it's for the people. It's not enforceable. It's not supposed to be. Then what is it? A reminder." She sipped her tea. "But without rules, how do we govern?" "You don't," she said. "You invite, you nourish, you offer muffins, and you stare when someone talks too long, without saying anything real. Silence. Then one by one, council members powered down their holograms, except one, the youngest, a floating sphere of language and light. Matriarch, may I visit your kitchen? She smiled. Bring your own spoon. That afternoon, a delegation of confused but deeply moved beings arrived. They ate soup. They shared fears. They cried over muffins. Someone brought a lost love letter to be proofread by Grandma, who circled one sentence and said, "This is the truth. Keep this. The rest is fluff." Veronica passed out teacups and emotional literacy guides. Captain Pickles taught empathy through interpretive screeching. And me? I sat quietly, in awe. Later that night, I found Grandma in the backyard. She was staring at the stars. No cape, no crown, just a cardigan and the gravity of someone who had outlived most metaphors. You tired? I asked. She nodded. But not done. What happens now? She looked up. The galaxy has taste now. It knows muffins. It remembers feeling. And that's enough? For now. She turned to me. You'll keep telling it, won't you? Telling what? The weird stuff. The good stuff. The stuff they try to edit out. I nodded. She smiled, and for the first time since this began, she blinked. The next morning, the universe was quieter, softer. Machines resumed their duties, but slower. Legal documents started with poetry. Meeting notes ended with recipes. And in the middle of every planetary archive was her sentence. Untranslated, unreadable by code, but understood by heart. Now, years later, I sit in a chair older than logic, next to a muffin warmer powered by hope. And I write, with that same pen, because the galaxy still needs stories. Not the flashy ones, not the clean ones, but the ones about soup and grandmothers and birthday cakes that could end civilizations, but chose not to because someone loved enough to stare it down. If your grandma taught an entire galaxy that kindness isn't soft and cinnamon isn't optional, would you carry her story forward? Would you remind the next world how to feel? Let me know in the comments, because next time, a single muffin shows up on a warship's control panel and nobody knows who baked it.